Cairo, Seattle.
It's time to get schooled with a professor, John Clayton.
Welcome to the podcast. Now, on Thursday, it may not sound like a big deal, and maybe for the big picture it isn't. There's going to be a supplemental draft in the National Football League. There's 6 players, including a long snapper, and there's a decent chance that maybe only one and possibly none of those guys will be taken. But what is a supplemental draft? And believe it or not, it is actually a big deal in the history of the Seattle Seahawks. What it was trying to get a draft that's available when for guys that didn't fit into the regular draft. Let's say they were kicked out of school, they got suspended, whatever it was, and it gave them a time in the summertime, usually like that second week of July, where you can have a draft right before the start of training camp and be able to take players who would be eligible in the next year or that year and get them into the league. Terrell Pryor was another example of a guy that was in the supplemental draft. But where it's a big deal in Pittsburgh is that this system started in 1977, and the first player selected was a running back named Al Hunter, who went to the Seattle Seahawks for a 4th-round pick. Running back out of Notre Dame. He was suspended from the team for disciplinary reasons, and then he came and obviously didn't have a distinguished career. But when you start talking through the years of supplemental drafts, and there's been big names, you've had guys like Bernie Kosar, Tim Rosenbaugh, Bobby Humphrey, a running back, Rob Moore, a wide receiver who had a great NFL career. Probably the biggest name was somebody who came to Seattle. It's Brian Bosworth. The Boz. And the Boz was a guy, and we got so many stories about him, came in, believe it or not, this would be the 30th year since the drafting of the Boz. And you go back to that 1987 team, it was a team that was loaded with young linebackers. The first-round pick was Tony Woods out of Pitt. The second-round pick was Dave Wyman out of Stanford. And then all of a sudden, here it comes that here's Chuck Knox, and here's the team, and here's an opportunity to get a guy like Brian Bosworth, who was an absolute freak on the field from what he showed in college. And we had strong safety type of speed, 4.4, 4.5 speed, had a body that would crash in. And, of course, the big thing, and I go back with Brian Bosworth so many years, I was very tight with his agent, Gary Wishard. And Gary really started to promote the Boz. They actually went to a deli in Norman, Oklahoma, and they started mapping out what would be the plan. And so what the plan would be to be a superstar, which of course he tried to be. He was a guy that was probably 225 pounds, that bulked up to 244 pounds, flew over the field, but they wanted to do it differently. They wanted to create kind of a rock star in a time when the sport didn't really have too many rock stars. So he had the hair that was all coiffed and cut, and had the blonde streaks put in there. He wanted to be as controversial as possible, and did so, and established a great career at Oklahoma. But naturally, the thought was, and he knew he was going to be good enough, that he would be going into the National Football League at the earliest possible time. Now, when it came time for his end of his Oklahoma career, there were some problems. I mean, he was tested positive for some, PEDs, if you want to call them that, toward the end of his college careers. And so the next thing it was, he ends up coming into the National Football League, but he did it with a flair. And that was what the Boz is. And many people will tell you who know him, Brian Bosworth isn't a bad guy, but there's two. You had Brian Bosworth, not the bad guy, and the Boz, who was like a completely different personality, a guy that was a showman, a guy that wanted to try to capture the headlines, do the different things, go against the grain, kind of be the guy. And this was something that was mapped out from the one time that they were sitting in Norman, Oklahoma, in a cafeteria, kind of a deli type of place, trying to go through all these things, and it all went as planned. So here he comes to Seattle, and the way the supplemental draft works is that, you have a certain number of balls or chains or whatever you want to call it based on your draft position, and they kind of go through that. It's a little bit different now, but you had the opportunity then to see if you can get him, and all of a sudden luck went to the Seahawks, and they thought in the sense that here comes the Boz. But of course, with that, you had to do something a little bit different. So his agent, Gary Wishard, came in and he wanted a very different type of contract. He wanted a 10-year contract for $11 million to try to establish a different number than most people have had and just set that aside. And then, of course, the Boz came in and certainly made a big impact in Seattle, both against the National Football League and against some of the established things. The first thing he wanted to do was demand that he would have a number 44 jersey. Well, guess what? That was in time that no linebacker could get his number into the 40s. So he got involved with a spat with the league, and he ended up losing that, and he had to take number 55. And, of course, he did that. I know dealing with him, I could go behind go behind and see him in a locker room and talk to him and stuff like that. But if I wanted to talk to him for an interview, he wouldn't do it because the Boz had to have an audience. He had to have somebody that was going to be around him with multiple. He would never give too many one-on-one interviews. That was just the nature of the Boz. Still remember the first week of the season that he had to make sure that his hair was cut a certain way, and it became a story I had to chase down on a Friday afternoon to see how his hair was going to be cut. Then, of course, one of the crazier stories is that he plays the Denver Broncos, and he immediately picks a fight verbally with John Elway, calls him horseface, goes ahead and buys different type of Elway Buster type of jerseys that he was selling in Mile High Stadium. But of course, you look at these things and who are they bought by? I mean, they were produced by Brian Bosworth, and so he was making money at the expense of John Elway, trying to make fun of him. So it was a fascinating thing, and it was certainly one of the more unusual things because Seattle wasn't that mainstream type of community. It didn't have a player with that type of flair. And through the many, many years, and we've now looked back 30 years, I don't know if there's very many that have been like Brian Bosworth in the Seattle sports market. I mean, his career was very short because, he did come in and, I think there's always that thought that steroids had kind of made him a little bit bigger than he was. He had 9.5-inch shoes. And I know I even attended the Lloyd's of London deal that he had because he had to sue Lloyd's of London to try to get the remaining amount of money. And they were using those allegations about him. And by that time, he was back in the 220s and all that stuff. Regardless, this guy was still an exceptional player. And I think he knew coming in, and I think this is why you saw Brian Bosworth come in and try to make as much and do as much as he could, because I think he realized his shoulders weren't going to hold up. The way that he tackled was trying to run through somebody, not try to take them out in a normal way. I mean, he wanted that impact because it made for great highlights, and it certainly accentuated his career. The weird part about how the career ended was that Ron Wolfley, a special teams player for then the the Cardinals, Phoenix Cardinals at that time, took him out, and that pretty well ended his shoulder, and that ended his career. And so now the next move, and you knew he was working on this with his agent, was tried to get into the movie business. And of course, he came and the movies weren't great. He had a couple action type movies, and did some things there, and his name carried over, but at some point it just didn't carry it long enough to have a long acting career, but he did some good things. I mean, listen, when you're going to be a player coming out of football, you're in your 20s, you're a guy that has a big name. I mean, he took everything. I think you can see both from the financial aspect and getting the most out of his reputation, getting the most out of football. I mean, the only sad part is what you have liked to seen is had he had a full career, how good he could have been. And of course, I mean, he was good. I mean, again, he was a guy that you either hated or you really liked. And of course, the younger the fan, the more they liked him, because in some ways, I mean, he was kind of the anti-hero. He was the one going against establishment. He was the one that was going to, be setting himself up, and he loved doing that. And that's one of the things that I think with his agent, Gary Wishard, they had set up, you execute a plan, and the plan turns out very successfully, and it had him covered financially in case the worst happened, and of course, the worst being that injury, and an injury that ended his career. So when you look back, I mean, the supplemental draft, there's been a lot of impact type of guys. The Bernie Kosar, for example, was a legend in the area in Cleveland. Mike Wall, a guard offensive lineman with the Green Bay Packers. He had a great career. But, Ahmad Brooks was a guy that had a lot of problems coming out of college, went to Cincinnati. It didn't work out in Cincinnati, and he's still playing in the National Football League with the San Francisco 49ers. A lot of these guys you see, they come in, Josh Gordon, for example, they had problems before that got him into the supplemental draft, but all of a sudden now they have problems, and he's been suspended now for most of the last couple of years. You have some bad tails. The tail in Seattle with Brian Bosworth was interesting. It came at a time when the Seahawks were, starting to become pretty good as a team. They had Ken Easley. They had a good defense. They had a great coach in Chuck Knox, and they had some pretty good runs. But the run of Brian Bosworth with this team in the supplemental draft, kind of reflective on that on this week of the supplemental draft. And by the way, we'll talk, you can, at the end of this podcast, a little bonus coverage. Sean Salisbury, who came into the team in 1987, gives you a little bit of reflection on what he remembers of the Boz. Coming up, we'll go ahead and talk to Dave Wyman, his teammate, and give you the full story of Brian Bosworth or the Boz. Yeah, it's hard to believe this is the 30th anniversary of a supplemental draft that had probably one of the biggest impact names, Brian Bosworth, that came to the Seattle Seahawks, and kind of reliving those memories, a guy that in 1987 was a second-round pick, and of course the Bosworth acquisition affected him as Dave Wyman. Of course, that same year in 1987, Tony Woods was drafted in the first round. So all of a sudden, here's a Chuck Knox team with 3 additional linebackers and 1 character in the Boz. Dave, what's your memory as you're sitting there, your second-round pick, all of a sudden they take the Boz, and here's 2 linebackers at the top of a draft?
Yeah, it was really the way that news hit me. By the way, there was another linebacker taken that year, M.L. Johnson out of Hawaii, and he actually had a pretty decent career. He was a good player, outside guy. So, yeah, you're right. We were loaded with linebackers. And, I found out about the supplemental draft on the day of my graduation from Stanford. I was sitting and reading the paper where some people sometimes will read the paper and see in the back page of the sports
in the Boz
page,
room, right?
Yeah, in the Boz room.
The Boz
there you
room,
go.
Yeah.
And I look on the back of the sports page, and it says Seahawks get Bosworth. Now, this is back when we didn't have cell phones or anything, so it's not like they called me or I got a text or anything. I read it in the paper the next day. So, and I knew that was coming, but, Bosworth was like he was like a rival of mine. I mean, I was on the Butkus Award watch list for a while. I think it dropped off when got around, they narrowed it down to 7 or 8, Cornelius Bennett, Shane Conlon. But Boz was one of those guys that and I watched him play a little bit, and he was amazing in college. He was just flying around making plays everywhere. So I thought, oh boy, here we go. Now what's going to happen to me? Because, Keith Butler came up to me at the rookie camp after I got drafted, and he said, look, you were brought here to replace me, so you might as well learn the game. So come stand next to me during, on the sideline. And I've told you this before, John Butler, he used to call me boy. Get over here, boy. I want you to learn the game. He had that thick Tennessee accent. But yeah, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to come in here and eventually replace Keith Butler, and now all of a sudden you get one of the best linebackers in the country. I think he was the Butkus Award winner that year. So it was pretty discouraging for me. I didn't really know what to think.
Football-wise, it looked like with Bosworth, he was kind of a combination of like Brian Urlacher, a guy that was a safety that had the great speed to play the middle linebacker position. A little bit of that, a little bit of Luke Kuechly, but just a different type of player.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison with Urlacher because, Brian was a smaller guy now, and that's the thing that you noticed about him. I think he wore size 9.5 shoes. And I remember our shoes were next to each other one time in the locker room. It looked like a father and son. He had like a 9.5 shoe. His hands were kind of small, but he was blown up, but he was really fast, like you said, and he could get to a lot of plays. And then he was just fearless out on the field. I mean, he just would take on anyone, anytime. I remember when they played Miami, and he said, you're going to have to drag me off that field afterwards. And he played like he was a warrior. But when he got in the NFL and it came time to, we ran a 3-4, John. So, you're lined up over a guard. You got to take on a guard. He was not taking on offensive linemen in college. They had it, they had their front loaded up. So he just flew around and made plays and made tackles. So that was a kind of a shock for him coming in, and he didn't have a lot of success doing that.
Well, the difference too is that he is the tackling. I don't know if he really learned how to tackle. He just wants to plow through somebody. I mean, he would run, and smack somebody, and get them down. But it wasn't like it was like the most perfect tackling technique.
Yeah, well, and I know he gets a lot of criticism for getting run over on the goal line against Bo Jackson, but that was just a matter of not getting your head across the bow there. He put his shoulder on the wrong side, and you can't do that with Bo Jackson. He makes that tackle and probably stuffs the guy in college, but this is Bo Jackson. You got to do it perfectly. So he did have, and then he had shoulder problems. But real quick, going back to the day of the supplemental draft, the way I understood it, John, everybody threw a certain number of keychains into a big fishbowl, and then they just drew it. So and you put in there, like for that year, the Giants won the Super Bowl, so they only got one keychain in there. And Tampa Bay, who was the worst team, got 28, because there's 28 teams back then. The Seahawks had 11 in there. So the way I figured, there's about over 400 keychains in there, and of the 11 that the Seahawks had in there, they selected that one. So that's how he came to Seattle. And you remember this, John. I think he wanted to go to either one of the big media markets. He wanted to go play for the Raiders down in L.A. or possibly New York, because he was kind of a show business guy.
Oh yeah, no question, and that's that strategy goes back. I mean, he had been working with his agent Gary Wishard really by his sophomore year. I mean, they had planned everything out, and everything that he did was strategic. And so you got to know Brian Bosworth, the friend and a player, and became pretty close. But the Boz was a little bit different. What was that Boz impact on the locker room?
Well, not many people really bought into that, and a lot of people were annoyed or would get mad about it. The offensive linemen didn't like him at all, and it's funny too, because after I'm brought in there, I'm drafted to replace Butler and be the next inside linebacker, and then they get Boz, and then they put him as my roommate during camp. So he was probably one of the first guys I got to know as far as the rookies go. And I just found out that Brian he's a great guy. We had so much fun, John. I mean, he was one of those guys that everywhere you went, everything just kind of opened up for you. Front of the line, all these perks and everything. But sometimes the Boz, when things started going sideways, he would kind of fall into that, and I didn't have much tolerance for that when it's just him and I hanging out. And I was like, come on, man, that's not on anybody but you. And, sometimes we get in fights over it and stuff like that, because, Brian's just the kind of guy that gave you a ride to the airport if you needed it. But the Boz sometimes could be a little bit, closed off and selfish, and, was just kind of a different character.
What was your reaction in that game against the Denver Broncos? I think that opened up the season, where, he bought shirts to rip John Elway. Called him horseface during the course of the week, and now you have to go out there and play him.
Yeah, well, and also the other thing he did, John, there was a big picture in the paper of John Elway, big, huge, full-size picture. So he taped that down to his bench in the locker room, and whenever the reporters would come in, he would take his pants off and sit down on Elway's face. That just make sure everybody saw that.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. And then he went out there and. So up in Denver, all the offensive linemen, we're sitting there in our lockers, and all the offensive linemen went out into the stands and bought these Boz Buster shirts, and it had a picture, like a likeness of Boz with the big red X through it. And so they all put them on, they go buy them, put them on, and come parading in the locker room like, look at us, and went right past our locker. And Brian just shook his head, and he turns to me and goes, those guys have just paid for new seat covers for my Corvette. I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, I made those shirts. His company, 44 Blues, made those shirts and sold them. So he was kind of like Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon was the first guy that I remember being a villain and making money off of it. And that's kind of the model that Gary Wishard, as you mentioned, John, his agent, and Boz followed. So they were there to cash in on, whether you liked him or you hated him.
How would you sum up his legacy as a Seahawk?
I think now, and I've talked to Dave Pearson over there, the vice president, and I know that he is, he remembers Boz and remembers what a good guy he was at the time, and so I think he's really open to welcoming him back and maybe having him come back and be part of the team again. But I think in the beginning, a lot of people in the Northwest didn't really like that show business side of him. And I remember one time I was in a bar, John. I was sitting there, and these people came up, and they purposely ignored Brian and shook my hand, said, "Hey, I think you're a great linebacker, Dave, blah, blah, blah." And I was really embarrassed by it because I thought they're really just trying to stick it to Brian here. So that kind of thing would happen. I think people got a little bit, they felt like he didn't deliver as far as the hype went. And then the Boz would say, well, they've built such high expectations for me here, I can never fill them. That was the Boz speaking. And I would say something like, Brian, you built those expectations. You're the guy that created that. And so, you were never going to live up to it, but, you made a lot of money on the way. So, but I think that for a while there, people, Boz became almost like a punchline after a while. But I think now people, just like Brett Favre returning to Green Bay. I remember when he went to Minnesota, everybody was like, he's never welcome back here again. Just give it 5 years. Give it 5 years, and they'll love Brett Favre again. I think it's the same thing with Boz, except sadly, as you pointed out earlier, John, we're getting old. It's 30 years now. Yeah.
And then finally, because his career was so short, injury, of course, being the reason, and maybe he kind of knew this was happening, was he considered a bust, or how good or how much of a lack of success did he have?
Yeah, well, again, he did have the high expectations, and some of that wasn't entirely created by him. It was just that he was such a good player in college. His rookie year, he played really, really well. I mean, I watched him, and he was I remember him picking up a fumble in Chicago. I remember blasting the quarterback there. I can't remember who it was. It might have been Harbaugh at that. No, I think maybe he was in Indy. But, yeah, he just was all over the place. He was making plays. And really had a good year. And I thought I was very impressed. His rookie year, he played really well. He was like an all-pro type of performance. But then after that, it just wasn't the same. He just wasn't the same guy. And I'm not sure why that was, but I think most of it was he had such a small frame that I think his body just wore down after a while.
Hey, Dave, thanks for the memories of a supplemental draft. This is a supplemental draft 30 years ago that had a big impact and a lot of interesting stories. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks for having me on, John.
Good news, everyone! It's time
to ask the professor.
That question is less stupid, though you asked it in a profoundly stupid way.
Looking at the supplemental draft here, of course, you have questions. You can, with the hashtag Clayton Schooled, get them to us, and we'll get them into the show. In fact, we got one here saying, who were some of the best players taken in the supplemental draft? And remember, there's 43 that have been taken through the years, but, I mean, there have been some good players. I mean, you can look at I know Al Hunter, was starting it off with Seattle in 1977, but, Dave Wilson was a quarterback taken by the New Orleans Saints with a first-round pick in 1981. Really didn't work out that well. Dan Sileo was a pretty good defensive tackle taken by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He was in 1987, third-round pick. Chris Carter went to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and you know his story. I mean, he came out of Ohio State and was taken by the Philadelphia Eagles. He was a guy that was suspended from his senior year for signing with an agent. Then he had problems in Philly, was let go, and went to Minnesota, and then had an absolutely great Hall of Fame career. Maybe you would have to say, as a Hall of Famer, he was one of the best. Bernie Kosar was a player that did good things for the Cleveland Browns, kind of pumped up that organization. Got one on the hashtag for Clayton Schooled asking, it's like, what's happened to the supplemental draft of late? And there really haven't been many good players for the most part. I mean, when you look at, Josh Gordon may have been the best. He's from 2012, taken in the second round by the Cleveland Browns, a number one wide receiver, but he had big-time problems. And, don't even know when he's going to get back in the league. In 2010, Josh Brent was a nose tackle taken by Illinois by the Dallas Cowboys. Did some good things. The team liked him, but he had an incident, where he was driving his car with, impaired and lost one of his teammates in that car accident. Unga was a player in 2010, a running back, fullback taken by the Chicago Bears. There really hasn't been too many. In fact, when you really look at it, since 2010, there have only been 6 players taken in the supplemental draft, and most of those, at least some of those, haven't worked out. I mean, Terrell Pryor was a third-round pick in 2011 and got to the stage where he came up to Seattle, was able to win the starting job that one year. year, but it didn't last, and then his career didn't last. He was basically taken because Al Davis really wanted him. So what do we have for this year's supplemental draft? Again, there may not be anybody that's going to be taken. Rajon Howard, a defensive tackle out of Purdue, may be the best player there, but he had a workout on Friday, didn't look to be in great shape. You got a long snapper taken, he's not going to go. Then you've got Jalen Overstreet, a running back from Sam Houston State, maybe an outside chance to get taken, but more than likely will be a free agent. You've got T. Shepard, cornerback from Ole Miss. He has probably one of the chances. And then you go to Calgary. This one's going to be an interesting. Rashawn Simonese is a big receiver with some good speed. He could go, but again, a lot of times what happens is you get into the supplemental draft and you go down 2 rounds where you might have gone in the regular draft. Cameron Walton, defensive end from Concordia, I don't know if he's going to be able to be picked. But the big thing with the supplemental draft, and that's why it's changed through the years. Back in the, I guess you could say the olden days, the Brian Bosworth days, it was set up so that, guys could kind of wait around and maybe make a big hit and get a first-round pick and get first-round money. Hasn't happened of late, but supplemental draft means a lot, and it meant a lot to the Seahawks. They started it in 1977, and they thrived on it with the Brian Bosworth. Hey, John Clayton here, and we've got a bonus. We've got Sean Salisbury, who was in the locker room when the Boz showed up.
I loved him, and I could remember when he came in, myself and him and David Wyman and Sam Merriman were somewhat inseparable during training camp. And what was great about it, and Johnny, covering at the time, he was 2 different guys. And to this day, I'm still friends with him. We were fortunate to work on Longest Yard together, and he's overcome a lot of stuff, and he's really trying, he's got his life together, and I'm really proud of him. And we'll see each other occasionally, because he was in Dallas for a while, and really proud of him. But I can remember the teammate, and I can remember the fervor that followed him, John. We'd be at the FX McCrory? Isn't that
right.
The place right across the street there? I remember we went in there one night, and it was as if it's the first time I experienced this. Now, having played with Marcus Allen as a Heisman Trophy guy at SC and been around some great ones, it was the first time that he went to athlete, and over almost like you were with a rock star. And I never knew what that was like. I'm telling you that we'd stand there and you'd be ordering a beer, and people would watch you as if they were watching a movie. That people, women and men, old and young, would stand there, and you're trying to carry on a conversation. And when he went out, he was the Boz. When he was with us around and you're sitting around talking, he was Brian. And there was 2 different guys, and that's the truest thing about it. But he was a great teammate and a nice guy. Loved being around him. But that's the first time. And I don't know if I've quite been around a guy that was a teammate that carried that kind of, that you felt like you were at a rock concert or you were with an actor and a football player, because the hair, the whole thing. And he knew how to play it to the hilt. But he was a great teammate, a great friend, a great guy. We had a blast with him, and you were like, man alive. It was weird that people would just sit there and stare at him. You'd be having a beer. They would sit and stare at him for hours while you're standing around. I'd never seen anything like it, and I'm not sure in all the years I played I was able to. It was like a Kardashian was with us. With that kind of. Can you imagine if social media would have been around, John, with Bosworth? It was quite fascinating. We used to give him a hard time about it, but he knew how to play it, and the sunglasses and the rest of it. But I have nothing but good things to say about him. And if he wasn't hurt with his shoulders, he could run. He could do it all. But it was just, unfortunately, the injury slowed his career down. But I'll never forget when he came and said, man, I can't believe this. This is going to be a teammate. And this was just the preseason when that kicked in. I'd never seen anything like it, and I'm not sure, being around an athlete, I've seen anything since, at least in person, of a teammate that I've had.
Had he stayed healthy, how good of a player could he have been historically?
John, the one thing they say is you can't teach speed, and he was, and David Wyman, as you well know, David was a great player as well. David was drafted later that year, and he overcame a gruesome injury at Stanford to become a really good player. Had he been able to stay healthy and never have an injury with his speed, he was so athletic and be able to run and get to the football. He'd have been special. I really believe that, because he was physical enough to take on guys bigger, but he was also fast enough. He had small, strong safety speed, but sideline to sideline. And those are the things you can't teach. And he had really good football instincts. So had he been healthy and been able to play, I would have loved to have seen it. And it was unfortunate. We've seen that with a lot of. I would have loved to have seen Bo Jackson, ironically, how he would have been had he been able to play a full baseball or just football career and play 15 years of it. So I think Brian, because he loved football and he loved contact, and that's a rare combination of loving contact, but also being fast enough that you can run. But he was sideline to sideline as fast as it was in the country. It would have been fun to watch. I think he would have been a really, really good player.